Jeff, this man has covered everything from the Olympics to the Masters for the 22nd time just a few weeks ago. Now he is a four-time New York Times bestseller. Author Ian O'Connor with his new book, Coach K, The Rise and Reign of Mike Krzyzewski. How does it sound to be introduced as a four-time New York Times bestseller, as somebody who started as a copy boy there?
Right. I did. I started as a copy boy at the New York Times, and I actually had a job before that doing town meetings, obituaries, death notices, and local high school sports for the Star Ledger in New Jersey for one of their bureaus in Springfield, and then ended up at the Times as a copy boy. My dream was to be a columnist, a Sports of the Times columnist at the Times. They had a number of Pulitzer winners who had filled that role, and so that didn't happen, but this is sort of the next best thing.
It
And I'm not even sure I ever read four New York Times bestsellers when I was young in the business. So to have four, my resume is a pretty good thing.
I was gonna say, it seems like you worked out pretty well for yourself. Before we get on to the book, I had to ask, one of your last assignments as a copy boy was to cover Reggie Jackson. How did you break all the rules to go get a picture with Reggie Jackson that I've seen out there?
That was it was actually an assignment, and he had some event. He was promoting a baseball card. And so I was young, and that's something I would never do today. I ended up talking to him and said, by the way, I was always a Reggie guy, and my brother was a Thurman guy. Reggie and Thurman, for those old enough to recall, did not get along while they were leading the Yankees to championships, and their relationship started to improve, unfortunately, before Thurman's tragic death. But anyway, it was either when you were a Yankee fan growing up in that day, you had to pick. It was either Reggie or Thurman. So he got a kick out of that, and he said, let's take a picture. So we did, and it's something I've kept, and I've reminded him of that. I'm sure he long forgot, but we'd see each other at Yankee games in my older years behind the batting cage in the pregame, and have some good conversations. But yeah, that was a wild and crazy time to be a Yankee fan. Billy Martin, Reggie, Thurman. And so it was a lot of fun to sort of grow up with those teams.
Hey, if you're still speaking to Reggie, can you ask him if he can bring back the Reggie bar? I don't know about you. I still miss it.
Yeah, that was, but yeah, I think he was pretty proud of that too. And I had a number of those when I was a kid. So he was the founding father of really that genre, if you will. But Reggie is someone who is extremely, extremely proud of everything he accomplished, including that.
So we'll get to the book here. And I mean, Coach K is somebody who you've followed for decades. And some may think this is a sports book or a book about Duke. It seems you've said that it's much more. You cited immigration, communication, leadership. Can you talk about the challenges that Mike Krzyzewski's family overcame as immigrants, and how that shaped him to be the person, the player, the coach that we all saw?
Well, his parents were the children of Polish American immigrants who came through Ellis Island and at the turn of the century. And his father changed his name from Krzyzewski to Cross to sort of avoid discrimination in educational and employment opportunities, not only for himself, but for his children. His parents did not have high school educations. They were laborers. They spent their adult lives working for wealthy people. And I think that had a really profound impact on Mike and his brother Bill, but particularly Mike. And his mother was a cleaning lady, and his father was an elevator operator, and very blue collar people who, they weren't poor, but they had enough for the basic family needs, and that was it. And so I just think Mike saw that his father gave up his name, and that they did labor for well-off people for their entire adult lives, and that had an impact on him. I think it lit a competitive rage inside of him that really shaped that Duke program and built it into the best college basketball program in the country. So at the core of what you've seen over 40 plus years at Duke was really, in my opinion anyway, and I think in others, the Chicago street kid just fighting to make his way in a country where people will take things away from you. And I think he was taught early on that you have to fight for everything and earn everything you get. And that's exactly what he did and why he ended up with more than 1,200 victories, a record on the men's side anyway that will never be broken.
As someone who's gotten to observe him over this long period of time, what's the one thing that you take most away from your observations of him?
I think, Jeff, he was a born leader, and people have described him to me behind closed doors just off the charts as a communicator, whether you're, despite your gender, race, age, financial status, if he has you one-on-one, he can make you feel like you're the only other person in the world at that moment. And that's a rare gift. It's something certainly I don't have. And I think he was a born leader. And then going to West Point, those skills were really honed. And you see a lot of that in how he built that program as a communicator, a motivator, really more so than as a strategist. A lot of coaches I talked to who competed against him and lost to him a lot said, we never saw him, particularly offensively, as a great strategist, but an unbelievable recruiter and motivator. And that's where he blew us all away. And to motivate, you have to be a great communicator, and that's what he was. And he just knew how to reach inside of his players and get things out of them they didn't even believe they were capable of doing. And that approach wasn't for everyone. He was an in-your-face coach behind closed doors in practice who would scream really difficult and tough, degrading things at you. And some players transferred because they didn't like that approach. But by and large, the overwhelming majority responded to it, became better players and ultimately better people because of that approach. And again, that's why he won 5 national titles and broke John Wooden's record of 12 Final Fours, going to a 13th in this final season.
So you decide you're going to write the book, you get everything ready, you think you're all wrapped up and done. Coach K says, hey, guess what? My last season. Now you got to make changes. Tell me how the retirement announcement of Coach K changed things for you.
Well, Jason, that was a good problem to have, because now I'm thinking, all right, well, listen, that could have been a very unlucky bounce if he said, I'm retiring effective immediately. And my book was coming out in February and he's no longer coaching. So I think it being his farewell tour season certainly was a fortunate bounce that could have gone the other way. And I knew when I started the process 2.5 years ago that he was facing the end game and he was going to retire at some point. So what I am glad is that he didn't end his career on that pandemic season, missing the NCAA tournament. That season was a complete wreck and mess for him. So to finish it on a Final Four season with a chance to win the national title. And I think even though it was a painful way to go out losing to his arch rival, North Carolina, the first team he ever lost to, his Duke coach, also became the last team he ever lost to. But I think it was a worthy finish. It was a classic heavyweight championship type game in the Final Four. And I think it was a more appropriate way to go out than, say, losing in the first round to Cal State Fullerton. So, but I think that the farewell tour and the way it played out was a challenge for me at the end as I was completing my book, but it was something that ended up being good for the book. And so I was happy to attack that part of it.
One of the other challenges, I think, for any writer who's going to write about a subject is the subject didn't talk to you for this, which is interesting. What was what's your understanding of what his reception was to the book and whether or not he was an obstacle in any other way or just didn't want to talk?
Well, first off, he could have made my life a whole hell of a lot more difficult if he had asked others not to talk to me, which he did not do. Bill Belichick, my previous subject for a book, he did exactly that. He lobbied people to not cooperate with me.
Of course he did.
Oh, yeah. And so Krzyzewski, I'll give him credit. He said, and he didn't know me a damn thing at the start of the process. He made it clear that, and I think his reasoning was he wants to write his own book in retirement, and that's fine. But he did say he would not block anyone else. And actually, I believe he encouraged some people to talk to me who were close to him. So I ended up interviewing his closest childhood friends growing up in Chicago, and many of his players and assistants over the years. Duke actually helped set up some interviews. And after the book came out, and you never know how people are going to react to basically an autopsy of their careers and lives. And it's not an easy thing to, I imagine, read the negatives and the flaws and mistakes, at least as I perceive them after doing 275 interviews for the book. So my understanding is he thought it was fair to very fair. And I think the one thing, and Duke directly told me this, some of his representatives at the university who've been there a long time, that they really appreciated that I was very transparent in the process. Any of the perceived negatives, I told them in advance were going to be in the book in case Mike or anyone else at Duke wanted to comment on them, wanted to try to amend the record, if you will. And so there were no surprises, and they knew exactly what was coming. And I think they probably appreciated that more than anything.
You mentioned the flaws, and the book does look at all different situations that he ran into. He had a bumpy start at Duke. He almost didn't know whether he was going to stay at Duke with the pressure. And I've seen you talk about a situation he had with the student newspaper. Can you talk about that incident and how that shaped what his relationship was with the student body going forward?
Yeah, he in 1990, this is going back a long way, but there were a couple of very benign articles written in the student paper, the Chronicle, by student journalists. And if you go back and read them, you would be shocked to feel that this should inspire a coach to fly into a rage over it. It was really benign stuff. But I think he was trying to send a message to his players that he was willing to have their back in almost any under any set of circumstances. And so he had his personal assistant contact the sports staff of the Chronicle, invite them to Cameron Indoor Stadium. So about 10 of those students ended up going down to Cameron, and they were ushered into the locker room. They were seated. Then the players filed in and sort of surrounded them standing. And then Coach K barged in and got into somebody's face and started screaming and shouting and cursing. And he's, in my 36, 37 years of doing this, he is the most profane coach I've ever been around. A lot of people are surprised by that. So
I am.
yeah, the first time I ever sat behind his bench.
I was gonna say, apparently all you got to do is sit behind the bench, right, Ian?
Yeah, and so that was 99, the Sweet 16 in New Jersey. Wow, it was 2 hours and 15 minutes of extreme, relentless profanity directed at everybody, players, officials, even assistant coaches like Quinn Snyder. So yeah, that's part of it. And he got in their faces, and it was pretty ugly. And one of the student reporters had a tape recorder running in his bag that was hidden. And Krzyzewski never said any part of this was off the record. So they printed his comments, if you will, from the tape. And it created a national stir. It got picked up in the New York Times and I believe USA Today and some big publications. And it was embarrassing to him. And I don't feel that his relationship with the student body was ever the same after that. I think Krzyzewski was under the mistaken impression that the student newspaper is basically an arm of the public relations department of the university. That's not the way it works. It's journalism, and he couldn't understand why a player or the team got a B+. The student journalist was doing a report card at mid-season instead of an A+. And again, it was silly, ridiculous stuff, and not very critical at all. But for some reason, he took great offense to it and went off on them. And I think he did pay a public price. That was the first time that America saw him in a different light, I think. And a part of Coach K that a lot of players saw behind closed doors, that there was still a decent amount of Bobby Knight still inside of him. And that was exposed in that article.
And so that brings me to the next question, since you mentioned profanity, which is Bobby Knight. And they seem to have had a very complicated relationship. And you talk about that in your book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think, listen, Knight coached him at Army and really raised him in the business, hired him at Indiana in the mid-1970s, those great Indiana Hoosier teams. Mike was a grad assistant in 74, 75 and learned how to compete and win at the highest level of Division I from Bob Knight. Knight helped him get his head coaching job at Army, helped him get the head coaching job at Duke. And then Mike starts to surpass him in the 90s and beats him at the Final Four. And that was the beginning of the end of the relationship. Knight just couldn't deal with it. The fact that his protege was now surpassing him as a head coach. And ultimately, their relationship ended in 2015 at a reunion at Pinehurst of Knight's first Army team, the 50th anniversary of that team. And Coach K approached him at a table, and Knight completely dismissed him and blew him off. And that was one of many, many slights over the years that Coach K had suffered and tried to overcome. This time he decided he had enough and he stormed out of the room, and some of his former West Point teammates went out with him. And he said, that's it. I'm bleeping done with this guy. I'm not trying anymore. And at that point, Mike was probably doing 90 to 95% of the work and keeping the relationship intact, and just decided to give up on it, and rightfully so. So my reporting shows that was the last time they ever spoke. And it's sad, because that's what, 7 years ago. And I'm not sure they'll ever speak again.
USA basketball plays a very prominent role in Coach K's journey and journeys he did not take, it seems. I wanted to ask you first about Beijing 2008, when LeBron held Coach K accountable by making him hold Kobe accountable. Tell us about that.
Yeah, LeBron wasn't the only one on that team, USA. So we're talking 2008, and there was a lot of pressure on Coach K, really everyone, to finally win the gold medal after the disaster in 2004 in Athens with Larry Brown. And then Coach K losing the world championship in 2006 in Tokyo in an embarrassing way to Greece in the semis, where Greece just ran one play over and over again to great success, a high pick and roll, and the US couldn't defend it. And so they needed to win that gold medal in Beijing in the worst way. And so Kobe was a big fan of Coach K's. He wanted him to coach the Lakers when that job was open in 2004. And so he wasn't really a problem on that team, but they got to a point in the prelims. So they're playing it in Shanghai against Australia right before the Olympic Games began. And all of a sudden, Kobe started taking some Lakers shots, not team-centric shots, and playground shots. And LeBron was upset about it, and other players were upset about it. So at one point in that game, LeBron James goes over to Coach K and says, "You better fix that bleep bleep." And everyone knew who he was talking about. And now Krzyzewski's like, the last thing in the world I want to do as a college coach in my first Olympic Games is to confront Kobe Bryant on shot selection. And Phil Jackson found out that's not an easy thing to do while coaching the Lakers. Now Coach K had to do it. But, he talked about accountability every day and holding each other accountable. And now LeBron was doing it to him. And after he had his own moments with LeBron James earlier, and he realized he had no choice. So the next day he pulled Kobe aside. He opened his laptop. He showed him some shots he was taking and said, "We can't have this. You could do this with the Lakers, but with Team USA, when LeBron James and Jason Kidd and Chris Paul and Carmelo Anthony are your teammates, we can't have this." And Kobe looked at him and said, "Okay, coach, I got it. It won't be a problem." And it wasn't after that. That's the last time that Krzyzewski had to address it. And he told LeBron, "Hey, I took care of it." And they went on to win the gold medal. The ironic part is at the end of that gold medal game against Spain, which got dicey, very dicey, Kobe Bryant had to make some acrobatic shots to win that game. So I think it worked out in the long run for everyone involved. But had they lost that gold medal game, they never would have heard the end of it. That really would have been a damaging blow to Coach K's legacy.
That Olympic experience changed him and changed how he dealt with things. You write about that. Exactly how did it change him, and how did it change his mental makeup for the one and done experience?
I think some of the Duke players thought he came back, for one, a little more player friendly. So he spent the time in Beijing. He's obviously not berating those players like he did the Duke Blue Devils, and he's not going to do that to LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. So they felt he got more, like, a little kinder and gentler to deal with in practice. And I heard that from a number of players. But yeah, he decided to dive headfirst into one and done. He came back and said, "You know what? After being around those guys, which was a lot of fun, I just want to coach the best of the best, whatever level we're talking about." So to do that, he had to accept one and done players. He went after John Wall, lost him to Kentucky. He got in late on him. But he getting Kyrie Irving, and after that, you had Austin Rivers, who was a slam dunk one and done at the time, Jabari Parker, then the guys on that 2015 team, Winslow and Okafor and Jones, who won him the national title. What's kind of amazing is, you could argue the best stretch of his career was the back-to-back championship run in 91, 92. and that might be, but you look at winning the national title in 2010 with that traditional upperclassman, not very talented Duke team. John Shire might have been the best player on that team, Kyle Singler, and a couple other guys, Nolan Smith. And then 5 years later, to win with basically a one and done team, that was really impressive. To do it two entirely different ways within a 5-year span to win the national title. So, but yeah, he decided after that. That led ultimately to the Zion Williamson, Cam Reddish, RJ Barrett class, and the attempt to win the national title with that group in 2019, which of course failed in the Elite Eight against Michigan State. But that Olympic experience definitely changed his approach to recruiting at Duke. And listen, not everyone at Duke loved that idea, and some felt, hey, we should stick with the traditional model of the 4-year player. It just wasn't plausible to do that and try to compete for Final Fours and national titles. And Coach K, at the end of the day, that was more important to him than anything, was winning. So he basically turned Duke into a one and done NBA factory like John Calipari was running at Kentucky. And a lot of people found that pretty hard to believe.
Do you think that it all played into his decision to retire, the wearing down of having to go through that year after year? And since we're dealing with that now in Philadelphia this week, do you think it played a role at all in Jay Wright, if you know?
Yeah, I don't know about Jay Wright. To me, that was surprising because he's a young guy. He's 60, and he's a young 60. Yeah. And my suspicion is he's got something else he wants to do with his life, whether it's TV. I think he'd be very good at that, or the NBA, maybe take a year off. I find it hard to believe he's done coaching, and he could definitely, he is the perfect college coach to make the adjustment to the NBA because he understands it's a player's game first. And I'm sure he has a fairly big ego, and rightfully so, but he has it under control, and he doesn't coach with ego. And I think that's a perfect mix with the NBA player today. So a year from now, I'd be surprised if there isn't a press conference introducing him somewhere as an NBA head coach, but we'll see how that plays out. I think with Coach K, it was really age. The pandemic season really took a lot out of him. He did not admit that publicly, but privately he did say that to some of his friends that I talked to. The transient nature of college basketball now, the transfer portal, and just players coming and going left and right. And these days, if you're averaging 17 minutes a game, but you think you should be getting 23, you're gone. You're leaving. Not too long ago, it was commonplace to stay and try to fight for more minutes and earn them, but that's just not the way it is anymore in college basketball. So I think you put all that together with, hey, I'm going to be 75 years old. At some point, I want to spend more time with my grandchildren. And so I think there were a lot of factors involved. The way college basketball is today with the constant turnover, I think, and the one and done, I think, was a factor. It's just not one that he would admit for public consumption.
You know, you mentioned Jay, and so I wanted to ask we've done a lot with the coaches versus cancer here on the show. We've interviewed Jay and all the City 6 coaches. Coach K was very involved with the V Foundation and a special relationship with Jim Valvano. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, their relationship, it's interesting. Valvano and Krzyzewski did not like each other. Going back to their younger days as coaches at Army and Iona, and they just had such different styles. Valvano with the gregarious personality. He could have been a stand-up comic. He was that funny, naturally funny, not forced. Krzyzewski wasn't like that at all. They just they did not hit it off, and frankly, they weren't friends for most of their ACC careers. And if you recall, when Valvano wins a national title in '83 and Dean Smith won it the year before, so now Mike's under a lot of pressure because the two schools next door have won national titles. And in year 3, Mike's losing to Wagner at home. And so everyone wanted him fired. The boosters, the alums, the students, the fans, the faculty, they all thought and wanted him gone. And so he had to fight through that. And the AD who believed in him at the time, Tom Butters, in hiring him, despite the fact he was 9-17 in his final season at Army, doubled down on it and gave him a contract extension, which seemed like the craziest decision ever and turned out to be the greatest move maybe in the history of college basketball. They did not with Valvano until Mike had success, and then Valvano leaves the profession, goes into TV. They started to develop more of a relationship then. And then, of course, in his dying days, Mike was in his hospital room at Duke every day. I think he was the last non-family member to see him alive. So not friends for most of their careers, but it was once Valvano got away from coaching and got into TV, and I think they found a lot of common ground, and they weren't competing so fiercely head to head, that they saw they had a lot more in common than they realized, and that developed a pretty special friendship until the day Jim Valvano died.
We could talk to you all day, but we know that you've got to run. I did want to ask you the last thing. You gave a piece of advice, a pro tip on an interview I saw about making the extra phone call. Can you talk about that life advice and how it got you an interview that most will never forget?
Well, in any industry, if you outwork people, that sometimes will neutralize or negate the fact that some might be more talented than you are. And certainly there are plenty of people more talented than I am in this business, but I don't think too many have outworked me. And so the extra phone call to me is just an example of grinding and finding a way, and how, if you do that, if you have a work ethic that is just really big on attention to detail 24/7, and that will get you where you want to go. So this is 2007. The Yankees are playing the Cleveland Indians at the time in the playoffs, down 0-2 in a best of 5. So now they have to win 3 straight sudden death games. George Steinbrenner still owned the team in his final year, really, of running that team. Most famous owner in the history of American sports. But his health had declined, and he hadn't given an interview in about a year. But I knew where he stayed when he came to New York, and word was he was going to attend Game 3 at Yankee Stadium in that series. Game 2, if you recall, Jabba Chamberlain was on the mound and was attacked by a swarm of midges from Lake Erie. And George Steinbrenner was really upset that Joe Torre did not pull the team off the field. The umpire should have done it, but they didn't. And he was upset at that. He was upset at the fact the Yankees were down 0-2. And also Cleveland, that's his hometown team. He didn't want to lose to the Indians in that playoff series. And now they faced that very prospect. So, but I was done for the day. That day, I had written a Roger Clemens column. He was pitching Game 3. And I hadn't seen my wife in months. I was working on an Arnie and Jack golf book. And we were supposed to go to dinner that night, but I knew where Steinbrenner was staying, and I just thought there was a 1% chance if I called. He usually did return my calls, but he had gone Greta Garbo that year, and his health was in decline. So it was bothering me that I was going to dinner knowing where George Steinbrenner was staying and figuring I still had a 1% chance to maybe get him on the phone. And I had called during the day that hotel and couldn't get through, and left a message. And I just thought, before I go to this dinner with my wife, I need to make one more attempt, or it's going to bother me all night. So I did, and I got the hotel operator. And the way it worked was the operator would then transfer you to George Steinbrenner's personal operator at this hotel, the Regency in New York. And I get the personal operator. She asked who I was, and I explained who I was. And she said, all right, hold on. So I'm sort of just waiting for her to come back and saying he's not available, he's not in, just I'll take a message like last time. And she got back on the phone and she said, go ahead, Mr. O'Connor. And I was like, what do you mean, go ahead, Mr.? And then I heard George's voice. Ian, how are you? And it was an unmistakable voice. And I had talked to him many times, and I was startled, and I had to gather myself and recover and start asking questions, because I figured this is not going to be a long interview. And he said that if Joe Torre, who of course became a Hall of Fame manager, if he doesn't win this series, I'll probably let him go. And he said about 5 or 6 other pretty fascinating things about Jeter, about A-Rod, about the Lake Erie midges. And so it was a pretty big story. It's probably the biggest story I ever had. It was the last interview George Steinbrenner ever gave. And he was firing a Hall of Fame manager in the middle of a playoff series. Now, the internet and Twitter weren't nearly as big then as they are now. And I can just imagine that story today, how that would have exploded. But it made enough noise back then. And ultimately, Torre was given an offer. They lost the series, of course. Torrey was given an offer designed to be refused. He refused it. He was sort of forced out, but also George Steinbrenner's sons basically said, "That's it, Dad," and they took over. And so that went down as the last interview he ever gave. And fittingly enough, he threatened to fire a successful manager in that interview. So I have to say, I was just proud that though my wife was upset we didn't go to dinner that night, I was proud that I at least made that extra phone call that evening.
Well, look, we will always make the extra phone call to you. We hope to have you back again. We could talk to you all day. Get your book here about Coach K. Get your book about Jeter, Jack and Arnie, Belichick. Take your pick. Read you in the New York Post. Ian O'Connor, thank you so much for the time and the conversation.
Well, thank you, Jason and Jeff. It was my pleasure. And best of luck. Congratulations on your success.
Thank you so much. You have a great day.
You too.